Hi, my name is Joe Fornasiero. I'm from Brighton, Michigan, and I have been into fitness for a very long, extended period of my life. I've been into fitness for close to 22 years now, and it's played a big part in my life and who I am as a person. So, really enjoy spending time with my friends and family. I got married about a month ago. I was diagnosed with something called desmoplastic small round cell tumor. Based on some of the research that I've done, it impacts roughly 1 out of every 1 billion people worldwide. And according to cancer.gov, there's only been about 200 cases since it was first discovered in 1989. The first symptoms that I started dealing with when I received my diagnosis, so it was abdominal pain and fatigue. So initially, when I started experiencing the abdominal pain, it was kind of in the lower left quadrant, and I had actually had a hernia surgery 6 months prior for a sports or weightlifting related injury that I'd had for over 10 years. And when I had the surgery, they found something that was like a small benign tumor in that region. Doctor said it was no issue, nothing to worry about, but because of the surgery and how they removed it, there might be some nerve pain in that area for up to 6 months. So this was completed in February of 2022. I started having symptoms and some slight stabbing pains again in that lower left quadrant for several weeks. And then at that point, I decided to, because of the symptoms that I was having, I reached out to a friend in the healthcare field who had also had his appendix out recently and spoke to him, tried to ask what the symptoms were. They were very in line with what I was dealing with. Just, again, mild abdominal pain. I would say a 6 out of 10 on the pain scale. And other than that, just some general fatigue where, at the time, this was in the midst of COVID. Work was very stressful. I worked in supply chain for a medical device company, so there was a lot going on in that space. But again, just based on the fatigue and the pain that I was feeling, I decided that I should go to the ER to get checked out. So those were my main symptoms. When I did go in and go to the ER, they pulled some lab work on me. There was a couple numbers that were slightly elevated. So almost implying that there was some sort of infection or something going on with the blood work. And because I was still experiencing the pain, they decided to do a CT scan on me at the time. And so did the CT scan. And maybe an hour or so later, the resident physician comes in and she looked like she had seen a ghost. And, we kind of had some conversation about what was going on, but she was kind of beating around the bush, so to speak, and not being very direct with me. And at one point in the conversation, as we got further into it, she asked me, do you have a strong support system? So, at that point, I really started to question what was going on and pressed her a little bit more for details or to be more direct with me. And basically what she said was, everything looks fine with your appendix, but we found multiple tumors and masses in your abdomen and pelvis. So after she said that, we had the conversation about the support system. She tells me, I have 10 minutes left in my shift and I'm going to take off and someone else is going to come care for you. But because we did the CT scan without contrast, we're going to do one additional CT scan with contrast to get better imaging and see if we can see, if there's anything else that's going on in there. So I sat there for several hours. I ended up calling my now wife to let her know, hey, I just spoke to a doctor. We thought this was nothing or maybe an appendix, and they think I might have cancer. So, she was kind of taken back by the comment that I made. She's like, there's no way that this could be cancer. How could they say that to you? You haven't had a biopsy. But based on the way that I was presenting on the scan, that's what the initial impression was, hence the next follow-up CT scan. So have the next scan with the contrast to get better visibility, and it comes back similar results, and they think that, there was a malignant cancer in my abdomen and pelvis. And they couldn't figure out what the primary was, but at that point, they came in and said, here's what we think you have. We don't know exactly what it is. We're going to schedule you for a biopsy and go from there. Here I walked into the building the healthiest person I knew. I've eaten healthy for years. I've exercised for over 2 decades. And yet here I am walking out with a potential cancer diagnosis. So that was almost euphoric, so to speak, because it's like, as someone as healthy as I was, I never would have expected that it would happen to me. But I've obviously learned that cancer doesn't discriminate. It can happen to anyone as I've gone through this journey. It was about 2 weeks later, so it would have been roughly like August 8th of 2022. They scheduled me for a biopsy, and it was a core needle biopsy where they go in kind of in the low abdomen and groin area with the needle. They snap the tissue out to get a sample. So they took several samples. I was awake for the procedure, but they just used like a local anesthetic to kind of sedate you, so to speak. And I ended up having to wait for, I want to say it was close to 2 weeks to get my results. Now, the issue is I went to a smaller healthcare system, and obviously they don't have the same tools from a cancer research perspective that some of the other hospitals have. So when I got the results, it came back as small cell carcinoma, which is actually a lung cancer. And when they called me, they shared that news, and really my initial hope was that it was going to be something that is much more common and curable, and it wasn't. So when they gave me the diagnosis, it was something that I had never heard of before, and B, because it was of unknown primary, where it was located based on the scan, we really didn't have any answers. So based on the severity of the diagnosis, I know it is a small cell carcinoma does not have a good prognosis whatsoever. So when I got the initial diagnosis, I ended up checking myself into the ER just because I wanted to get on treatment immediately. Now, after I did the first cycle of chemo and talked with the team of doctors while I was inpatient in the hospital, they were open to me going and getting a second opinion. Because what I had was so rare, we decided that we were going to go get a second opinion. So once I was discharged from that first cycle of chemo, I was home, and I started doing a lot of research to see what are some of the top cancer hospitals in the world, or especially within the United States for that matter. And the two that I came up with were MD Anderson and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. So what I decided to do was I scheduled an appointment with MD Anderson based on my diagnosis of small cell carcinoma, and had the sample sent down to Houston for them to review. I booked an Airbnb, flew down there with my family and my now wife. And so again, go in there for the appointment. And when I get there, I see the oncologist for, again, lung cancers and things of that nature. And she tells me, she comes in the room and says, I don't think I'm the right person to see you because it's of unknown primary. It's primarily located down in your abdomen and pelvis. It's not in your lungs. So I don't think I'm the right oncologist for you to see. Now, with that being the case, they didn't schedule me any other appointments. So I had spent all this time and money to get down to Houston for a second opinion, and I had no answers. So at that point, I was incredibly frustrated. Here I am going to the top cancer hospital in the world, and I have no answers, and I felt like I wasted my time. So as kind of a last-ditch effort on the way out, we decided to see someone who specialized in clinical trials, just so that way if there, as we went through the cancer treatment process, if we needed a salvage effort or to understand what clinical trials were available to me, I wanted to get in the system with that oncologist. So I saw her, and this was the last day that we were in Houston. And as we were leaving, they had just got the biopsy results from my sample. And it came back as Desmoplastic small round cell tumors, or DSRCT is the acronym it's known by. When I spoke to the clinical trial doctor, she just said, we don't have any clinical trials for this particular cancer right now. So I recommend that you go and, get started on treatment, kind of figure things out from there. And at that point, we came back home because we really didn't have any answers at the moment, right? So the thought was we would come back home and I would go back to the original hospital and start another cycle of chemo. But again, once I got that diagnosis and I had my follow-up appointment with the local Michigan oncologist, I shared that I have DSRCT, and his response to me was, I've never treated someone with that. I've only heard about it one time in a textbook back when I was in school. I highly recommend that you go somewhere else to get treated. So when I got that information, we reached back out to MD Anderson just to coordinate and say, hey, here's the new diagnosis. Obviously, I need to go see a sarcoma specialist. And at that point, they had scheduled me with a sarcoma specialist at MD Anderson to come back for another appointment. So again, just with the way that things kind of panned out with the first appointment, I was still pretty upset and frustrated. But because of the reputation, I wanted to go back there. Because again, with something so rare, I wanted to do whatever I could to make sure that I got on the other side of this and make sure that I was going to the number one ranked center in the world. Once I saw the correct oncologist down in Houston, the treatment plan was to do 6 cycles of vincristine, doxorubicin, and ifosfamide. So that typically is a very aggressive regimen, and really tries to get things under control as quickly as possible. So we started with that, and at the time, one of the comments that the oncologist made to me is, you're extremely fit, so I'm going to try and throw everything at you and see how you do. And see how things progress. So with that being the case, I did my first cycle of chemo. For the first one, I was actually inpatient, just to make sure if I had any complications or anything like that, that I could have, adequate care and not be stuck at home and have to come back to the ER if something did go wrong. But, I got through my first cycle. It did go relatively smooth. I didn't run into too many complications. And again, I really attribute that to the exercise and nutrition that I focused on leading into my cancer treatment. So did the first cycle, kind of went through the process of recovering. And one of the issues that I found after my first cycle is they use something called Neulasta to boost your white blood cell count after a cycle to make sure that you're not neutropenic. And what I found was I had severe side effects to the Neulasta shot, to the point where I was getting severe radiating bone pain all throughout my back and my body. After I completed 6 cycles of chemotherapy down in Houston, at the time, all the surgeons had retired from MD Anderson that were doing this kind of special and intricate procedure on the abdomen to remove any tumors. So I did a lot of research and found Dr. LaQuelia, who is located up in Memorial Sloan Kettering. He's been doing these pediatric abdominal surgeries for nearly 40 years. So, as far as surgeons that were still available, and there's only a handful of them in the country that actually specialize in something like this, he was, the number one ranked. So one of the new protocols that they follow is they break up, instead of doing a 20 to 24 hour surgery, which is more taxing on the body and you have more blood loss, they break it into 2 surgeries, make it a little bit easier, and then it gives them more time to focus on those intricate areas to make sure that there's nothing missed. Because if anything gets missed, even if it's microscopic, your cancer could come back, and all that work was done for nothing. So the first surgery was 10 hours. They focused on the upper half of my abdomen and into my chest. They removed some lymph nodes around my heart. They took out my spleen, which is a huge component of your immune system, a portion of my diaphragm, as well as the omentum. So it's kind of a layer of fat that holds your organs in your body. And then just obviously some tumors and additional lymph nodes there. So, the initial part of the surgery went pretty smooth without any issues. I was up and walking within 24 hours of the surgery. And again, this is a 12-inch incision from your sternum all the way down to your groin. After I did the first surgery, I came back to Michigan to recover. I did 2 additional cycles of somewhat aggressive chemotherapy just to, again, keep anything at bay or prevent it from growing while I was recovering. And again, because of the complications that I had during the first surgery, those first 2 cycles were very tough. I would say probably 2 of the worst cycles that I had throughout this journey, just because I was very fatigued. I was getting sick. I was throwing up. And it was just really tough on me during that period of time. So as I started to transition to, into the recovery process and started feeling better, I think only about 8 weeks had gone by since the first surgery. I had done 2 cycles of chemo, and I get a phone call that, hey, it's time to come back and do your next surgery. So, you imagine you've spent all this time feeling awful, and you just start feeling better within like a week or 2, and you get a phone call that you need to go through this entire process again. But again, knowing that this is the only way to get rid of the cancer, I was ready to get back and get this over with, because this was my opportunity to be in remission, or NED, no evidence of disease, and move on with my life. So They called, we scheduled the surgery for May 25th of 2023. And I flew back to Houston, went through all the initial, did another PET CT scan just so they had the latest imaging prior to my surgery, and everything kind of went off without a hitch on that. And this time around, it was another 10-hour surgery. Everything went pretty smooth for the most part. They removed more tumors and lymph nodes down in my pelvis. And they said, based on what they were seeing, everything looked clear. They removed all visible cancer. And at this point, I was considered in remission. After I got the news that I was in remission, I was very happy. But there were still doubts in the back of my mind because I've done an extensive amount of research on DSRCT. I've looked at, there's a DSRCT support group on Facebook that I've spent hours and hours looking at other people's situations, what they've done, and where they were in the treatment journey. So although I was happy and relieved that I was in remission at this point, I still had doubts in the back of my mind that this could just be a temporary situation. At that point, because I had gotten through most of the aggressive cycles of chemo with success, I asked my oncologist in New York City if she minded if I could do 2 more of the aggressive cycles of chemo after my second surgery, again, with the goal or intent of minimizing the chance of reoccurrence. So she agreed with me. She said, if you think you can do it, I do think it's a good idea and I'm not opposed to it. So when I got back to Michigan, had about 3 to 4 weeks to recover from that second surgery. I jumped back on the same chemo regimen that I did in the interim between my first 2 surgeries. And again, got through that. Those were some long days. It was I was in the hospital for 9 hours, Monday through Friday. And really, that was pretty taxing just from a fatigue standpoint. But got through those. And then I had a couple weeks to recover. And the next step in the process for me was to do whole abdominal radiation on my abdomen and pelvis. I did the radiation. The first week was pretty smooth for the most part. You just you lay on a table. This machine goes around your abdomen and pelvis for about 30 to 40 minutes. And as I started to get a little bit further into radiation, I started to have some complications. So I was very fatigued. The other thing that would happen to me is when I would go to eat, if I ate anything more than a small meal, it would cause these coughing fits for me. And then either I would be coughing or even to the extent where I would get sick and vomit sometimes just because of what the radiation was doing to my body. So that was another really tough period of time for me, just because when I get very exhausted, it starts to impact me mentally. And when that happens, you start to question things like, why am I doing this to myself? I feel so horrible. I don't know if I want to do this anymore. But again, I think a lot of it comes down to just how you reframe your mind. Once I finished radiation, the next step or the recommendation was to do 12 cycles of maintenance chemo, again, with the intent of minimizing the chance of reoccurrence. So now, shortly after I finished up the 4th round of chemo, I ran into some complications. And what I found was I started noticing shortness of breath. And that went on for a couple days. And then after that, I noticed that my heart rate was jumping up pretty substantially. I was getting these notifications on my Apple Watch that my sleeping heart rate or resting heart rate, my sleeping heart rate was much higher than normal. And that I should probably reach out to a doctor based on the findings that they were showing on the watch. So as I went into treatment on the following Monday to start my 5th cycle of chemo, I said to the doctor, I said, hey, I'm dealing with shortness of breath and my heart rate is jumping all over the place. And I feel like something's wrong. So we ended up deciding to hold off on doing chemo that day. They scheduled me a CT scan because they were suspecting that I might have a pulmonary embolism or a blood clot in my lungs. I did the CT scan and the results came back that my lungs were actually clear, but I did have what's called a right atrial thrombus, so a blood clot in my heart, the right atrium of my heart, that was 20 millimeters, so almost 1 inch in size. They sent me home with blood thinners, so I was injecting the blood thinner medication into my abdomen, typically I think once or twice a day. And I did that for a week, and really my symptoms weren't getting any better. So at that point, I decided to go back and check myself into the ER because I wasn't improving as quickly as I thought that I should. And when I got to the ER, they did some kind of initial like diagnostic testing, so like an echocardiogram just to check my heart function. And when I got the results of the echocardiogram, it showed that I was in early stage congestive heart failure. And that was some very tough news to digest because, again, as someone who's been so healthy and really got through the majority of my treatment with flying colors thus far, that was extremely difficult for me because it's like, here I am experiencing these issues, and I thought that I was doing good. Like, I'm supposed to be on the other side of this by now. I had another PET CT scan about a month or 6 weeks after the blood clot situation. At that point, I had been off treatment for roughly 6 weeks. The scan came back NED, or no evidence of disease. So here we are. I had my first scan after being off all treatment. I'm clear. And at that point, like, I'm starting to get my confidence back that things are heading in the right direction. I think I finally have this behind me, and I did everything possible to get to this situation. So now it's time to start getting back to the normal life that I had prior to cancer was the goal. But then I got to the point where, a couple months had gone by. I was still struggling with fatigue. So I wanted to wait until I had my next PET scan, which was June 15th of 2024. And one of the issues that I noticed right before my scan, about a month prior to my scan, I noticed I had some swelling in a couple lymph nodes up in my neck. And during this time, it was May in Michigan, so it's kind of seasonal allergy time frame. And I thought, it's probably just allergies. And at this point, I thought everything was going to be clear with the scan. I had a clean one back in March. Overall, I feel pretty good, not 100%, but again, that's to be expected after nearly 18 months of nonstop treatment. I get the scan results back, and everything is clear in my body, with the exception of 2 lymph nodes in my neck. So at that point, I felt like everything changed, right? The rug had been ripped out from under my feet because I had gone through 18 months of treatment, had all these complications at the end, and finally said, you know what, enough is enough. Like, I need to go and try and just feel better and feel like a normal person again so that I can try and enjoy some semblance of life. And here I am with a cancer reoccurrence, but a few months later. So that was pretty tough for me to deal with at first. Based on that, my cancer was back in my neck, and I had to start treatment again. So after speaking with my oncologist team in New York, as well as the team in Michigan, the goal was to do surgery as quickly as possible. But again, with the way that our healthcare system works, it's not like I can just go in tomorrow and get surgery to get this removed. It takes time. So in order to be proactive, I decided to do 2 cycles of chemo before my surgery. So I just finished up what was now my 17th cycle of chemo last week. And, the first cycle was a little bit tough just because I had the trauma of they had to put another chemo port back in my chest. I will likely be on chemo for an extended period of time because of how quick my reoccurrence took place. And this will allow me to know if this chemotherapy regimen was successful, I will likely stay on this again after my surgery, and just to make sure that I don't end up having another reoccurrence. From a mental health perspective, it's been interesting for me. There's obviously, in any cancer diagnosis, there's a lot of ups and downs and emotional battles that you deal with as you go through the process. But, for me, and again, I revert back to because I was so disciplined with exercise and nutrition for all those years, like, this just ended up feeling like another challenge to me. No different than what I've done in the past. It's a challenge that I'm faced with, and I'm going to figure it out and figure a way through it to get on the other side of it. So, obviously I was upset. I was nervous. There's these not hopes, but these fears that go through your mind, as a cancer patient and someone that's dealing with an extremely rare diagnosis that does not have a good prognosis. There's a lot of thoughts that come along with that. I think some of the toughest things are like envisioning myself laying on my deathbed and having to say goodbye to my family. Like, that is very emotionally taxing. My wife and I are both very focused on self-improvement and being the best version of ourselves. So one thing that we have done as a couple for several years is we go to counseling, and it's not, we didn't start because we were having issues in our relationship. We wanted to be proactive so that we had good communication mechanisms in place, so in the event that something did come up in our relationship, because no relationship is perfect, that we had the proper tools and mechanisms in place to navigate our relationship and make sure that we didn't run into any issues that some couples would face, A, in their day-to-day lives, but B, as someone who's faced an explosive emotional situation such as a rare cancer diagnosis. I applaud my family for is they've been fantastic throughout this entire situation. And despite having, terrible news multiple times throughout this entire journey, like, we can still have fun, laugh, joke around, and sometimes make light of an extremely dark situation. So that's, I'm extremely grateful for my family, because without them, like, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. And I'm grateful for that. It's important to have that support system. And I've noticed, like, being around my family makes me happy. And on the days that I'm struggling with treatment or feeling down, like, getting together with my brother and stuff like that, just, it helps. You could be faced with some of the worst adversity in your life, and it really boils down to how you approach your situation and the thoughts that you have. So, in any difficult diagnosis, there's always going to be statistics, and they may not be in your favor, but chances are there are outliers. It is possible, and why couldn't that be you? So the key is to make sure that you are doing everything, both mentally and physically, that you can to give yourself the opportunity to achieve the highest chance of success. And if you do that and you feel like you have a purpose in your life, and whether that's anything that's important to you, or if you want to try and make a difference and improve the lives of others, you have to have a purpose for why you're doing what you're doing. And I think that's critically important in order to push yourself through the tough days, because if you don't have purpose, you can really go downhill quickly, just from a mental health perspective, and that, I feel, has made a big difference for me in my life.